My name is Bill Frelick. I am the director of Human Rights Watch's Refugee Rights Program. And basically what our program does is documents human rights abuses that are relating to refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, migrants that are part of mixed flows with refugees. And we look at the conditions basically from the start, from when they're first displaced in their home countries, to the problems that they encounter getting out of their home countries, if that's their desire, problems at borders in particular, and with asylum space, as we call it, what happens in host countries and beyond.
How would you evaluate the international solidarity that has been shown up until now?
Well, I think there's been an abysmal failure of solidarity, basically. What we see is essentially 87% of the world's refugees are really located very close to home in the surrounding countries, in the developing world, basically. And it hasn't been until very recently when 1 million refugees and migrants came into Europe in 2015, that the rest of the world has sort of picked up and taken notice that this is suddenly a crisis, when in fact it's been a protracted series of crises that have been taking place for quite a number of years. And so we're really looking at protracted refugee situations from Somalia, from Afghanistan, and at this point the Syrian crisis has to be looked upon as a protracted crisis because it's been going on now for 5 years plus, and there's no end in sight to the drivers that are forcing people from their homes. There were 2 summits that actually took place, one on September 19th, which was a Ban Ki-moon, UN hosted summit, followed by the Obama-hosted summit the next day. The UN summit we were fairly critical of, really, as being a lot of sort of platitudes. Some of that, some of the language was quite positive, particularly in response to the xenophobia that we're hearing in so many places around the world. However, it really lacked a strong reference to what we think is going on many of the front lines of where refugees are being pushed back, and that the amount of solidarity that was really being expressed to refugee rights and to migrants' rights was really lacking in that first day. I think the second day we have a better feeling coming out of that one, and that is much to the credit of President Obama, because he really set forth 3 pretty concrete recommendations. First, to double the number of resettlement offers being made worldwide. Secondly, to raise by 1/3 the pledges for humanitarian assistance in response to the crises that we're looking at. And finally, sort of a combined 2, which are inextricably linked, and I think he was smart to link the 2, is trying to get assurances that 1 million additional refugee children would be able to go to school, and also that 1 million of their parents, basically, of refugee adults, would be authorized to work. Now, we haven't seen a really clear breakdown of the pledges that were made at that conference. We have met with the White House, and they have said that the markers were met for all of those objectives. So we're still waiting to basically see how it really pans out in terms of how concrete the pledges were over what period of time, and looking not just quantitatively but qualitatively. When they say resettlement, what are they really meaning here? Are they giving scholarships, for example, which is perfectly fine, but that may not be a durable solution for refugees. So we want to look at it very carefully. The other thing that I think was very important about the New York summits is that the private sector really came in to play. And so you had corporate leaders. You had the head of Chobani Yogurt, who comes out of Turkey, although he talks about Greek yogurt, of course, and really making some concrete pledges for his company about employing refugees and showing a real commitment to doing that work. And George Soros as well, coming forward with some concrete pledges too. So seeing the private sector getting involved and the private sector wanting to look at innovative ways to put refugees to work, to get refugees in school, and to look at other pathways for legal admission of refugees is all very, very positive.
I was wondering if there's an upcoming election in this country. So how do you feel this would affect the process?
Well, I really have to give President Obama some credit here, that I think it was courageous of him right before an election to really talk about doubling refugee numbers and to committing to increasing the U.S. take of refugees from 85,000 currently to 110,000. Now, of course, that has to be negotiated with Congress. This is a question that will go back to the Congress in terms of budgeting for that increase in refugee admissions. But for the President of the United States to basically say, this is needed, this is part of international solidarity, this is a responsibility, and we want to provide this kind of leadership to the world, I think is a very important message, particularly at a time when in the U.S. presidential debate, the actual numbers have been completely misstated and have been exaggerated, as well as the quote-unquote threat that refugees represent. The candidate for the Republican Party, Trump, talked about refugees being a Trojan horse coming into the United States. And that really doesn't take into account the very, very careful vetting that usually takes about a 2-year period of time, going through all of the security agencies of the United States, the intelligence agencies, Interpol internationally, UNHCR making the referrals in the first place, doing their own vetting, and on and on and on. These are thoroughly vetted people that come to this country as refugees, and to just say that that they're bringing in people in an exaggerated number that's not the true number, and that they represent a threat because they're not carefully vetted is just untrue.
So I was wondering, first of all, how do you evaluate the media coverage of the refugee crisis?
I mean, I think there's a tendency on the part of much of the media, not all of the media by any means, to sensationalize, any crisis. That's how you sell newspapers, after all. So it's somewhat understandable that the more populist the tabloid may be, the more sensational it's going to be in the presentation of whatever situation it is. And you can do a close-up of a food line where things erupt and make it look like there's an enormous riot taking place, when if you panned the camera away from there, you would see people, that are sitting around in a very normal fashion. I've been present at places where you had that kind of occurrence happening in the last year. And I think also, just looking broadly, I mean, we're talking about the European Union with a combined population of, I think, 500 million people or so. And so, yes, 1 million people did come into the European Union last year, but it's a very, very small fraction of the total population. And the absorptive capacity of the European Union, again, not to minimize the problems and the lack of solidarity, which meant that Greece, for example, has seen a far greater impact of those numbers than, say, France or other countries within the EU. If this had been managed correctly, and if the responsibilities had been shared more equitably, this was an eminently manageable problem. It didn't have to be looked upon in crisis mode. But I think it was presented very much as a crisis and as a security threat and as a threat to European culture, if you will. And I think all of these elements are ones that can be presented in a superficial way and in a sensational way, or they can be presented in a way that looks at many of the people that were coming in and seeking asylum in Europe as being really quite ordinary people with backgrounds that I think are actually quite sympathetic, and that it wouldn't take a great stretch for Europeans to remember their own history of the last century, and when there were many, many people that were displaced, millions in fact, that did seek refuge in other countries, and find that what we're seeing taking place currently is not entirely different from what Europeans themselves have experienced.
The EU-Turkey agreement. Many have condemned the agreement as illegal and against international law. EU member states have conveniently overlooked the situation in Turkey with an already overburdened asylum system and already hosting about 3 million refugees, as well as a stable political setup. First of all, what's your view on the implementation of the EU-Turkey agreement? Do you believe that Turkey has fulfilled its obligations so far, and to which extent? And your personal sort of prediction for the coming year.
Yeah, well, I think the EU-Turkey agreement is basically on life support, and most people look at it that way. And that's on several different levels. I mean, one, simply, the head of the Europe Bureau of UNHCR recently said that not a single person who's been returned to Turkey under the agreement has actually, a Syrian has been able to get temporary protection since being returned to Turkey. That's a pretty serious problem with implementation right there. Since the coup, Turkey has withdrawn its officials, as I understand it, from Greece that were involved in actually, seeing that the transfers would be going in a orderly manner, and so that's another problem. The Greek appellate committees have also been unwilling to call Turkey a safe third country or a safe first country of asylum. There are two different, criteria within the European Procedures Directive, and this, of course, is really what the agreement rests on: is basically being able to rule as inadmissible, fairly quickly, large numbers of asylum seekers, and it's all to the credit of the Greek appeals committees to basically say, look, let's take a look at this. Let's look at the criteria and see whether Turkey really qualifies as a safe third country or as a first country of asylum in the EU context of what that means. And some of the criteria on safe third country in particular essentially means you do need full refugee status, and by its own limitation to the Refugee Convention that it has acceded to, Turkey only recognizes people coming from Europe, originating in Europe, as being refugees, and therefore Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, Somalis, basically all the refugees that are there, cannot get full refugee status. Syrians get temporary protection, but that's limited, and we've seen a lot of obstacles for Syrians to actually get registered for temporary protection, including those now who have been returned under the agreement. But that doesn't even apply to the other nationalities who don't get temporary protection and have had even greater difficulties getting work authorization, being able to send their children to school, to be able to live a decent life in the country. Beyond that, the treatment of people who are inside the territory of Turkey, and whether Turkey is adequate for their needs as an asylum place that you could be returning refugees to, is the question whether Turkey respects the principle of non-refoulement. This is the fundamental foundation of refugee law. And here what we've seen is that Turkey is actually setting up on its border with Syria, concrete walls and barbed wire and watchtowers that are shooting people. And Human Rights Watch, has documented asylum seekers approaching the border with Turkey, reaching the border and being pushed back and being shot, and in some cases killed by Turkish border guards. This does violate the principle of non-refoulement. You don't have to be deported from inside the territory and sent back. If you are fleeing persecution, if you are fleeing these threats to your life, and you are rejected at the border under international law, under the concept of non-refoulement, that is a violation of that fundamental principle, which is a principle of customary international law, not just under the Refugee Convention, only applying to European refugees.
Do you see any way out of it anytime soon?
Well, I think, there are also broader political problems with the agreement. That this was part of a broader deal for accession of Turkey into EU membership and for visa-free travel for Turkish nationals. And particularly since the coup, I think all of these questions are very much in the air and completely unresolved. So, whether on both sides of the agreement there's really any recognition that this is something that will be able to be made permanent, either in terms of the broader deals that this agreement cannot survive without, or the implementation of the agreement internally, just in the way that that refugees and asylum seekers are being treated in the adjudication process in Greece and in the receiving of them in Turkey. I think it's. I don't think it's. I don't see any way out for this deal as it's currently conceived to be able to function.
One would argue that Europe's migration policies are turning Greece into a giant holding pen. So the borders are shut since March, and in your latest report on Greece, you stress the shortage of suitable accommodation and the lack of comprehensive protection system for child asylum seekers and migrants. So can you please comment on the situation in Greece right now and which measures do you consider necessary in order to stop arbitrary detention and violations of children's rights?
I was one of the researchers for our report on Greece. I was doing work on what are called the hotspots in Lesbos, Samos, and Chios islands. And I have to say, I was just appalled. I mean, the conditions were horrible in all three of those locations. To have on the territory of the European Union, in Greece, conditions in which people couldn't even put any kind of a roof over their head. They were actually trying to buy from vendors, canvas and plastic sheeting and pup tents to house themselves because they were being held in these places and couldn't even be given basic shelter. But more of even greater concern than that was the lack of basic security. I mean, these are people that were fearful. We were seeing violent attacks. We were seeing people that were, in food queues where fistfights would break out, brawls that were taking place involving, dozens and dozens of people at night. One of the most appalling things I saw was a woman of Eritrean nationality from Africa being put into a prefabricated shelter, if you will, with men of different nationalities. These were South Asian men, Pakistan, Afghani men. Just ludicrous. I mean, they were begging to be put into a safe area of the camp for women, and which is a completely understandable and just a normal sort of request, and to not find any responsible Greek camp managers that we could even speak to talk about their situation. Just an absolute failure of basic protection, basic sustenance. I mean, to put people in that situation, to endanger them in that way, and the filth, the dirt, broken glass. This is, you've got children in there. I mean, absolutely appalling conditions. Now, start pointing fingers anywhere you want, but Greece has some fundamental responsibilities here for people that are on its soil, no matter what. And you're detaining these people. They don't have a choice but to be there. And the conditions in which children are being held are just appalling as well. And of course, this is an EU member state, and the lack of solidarity on just the most basic human level among EU member states, and a willingness to just sort of build their own internal walls and keep 60,000 people penned up in Greece, knowing the economic conditions in Greece itself and the problems in that country, is something that is just completely unacceptable. And it's really hard to imagine that Europeans, if fully informed about what these conditions are, would be willing to ignore this kind of a situation. This is as basic as it gets, and it's an abysmal failure on the part of the European Union and its member states, and it's really shocking that in 2016 you could treat people and put them in conditions that are worse than when you think of European sensibilities about how you treat animals. This would shock the sensibility of the way you would treat an animal.
What do you think are the main reasons of failure at the EU level?
I think we've seen a complete failure of the notion of a unified Europe. It's every man for himself. I hate to be gender specific, but hey, why not? It's dog eat dog, it's beggar thy neighbor. I mean, I can come up with cliche after cliche, I suppose, but basically it's a resurgence of nationalism, of selfism, tribalism, whatever. It's like my group, how narrow can I get? Build a wall around me and mine, and keep everyone else out, and basically take no responsibility for anyone beyond yourself. And maybe, to the extent that the European Union, sees itself as a union, it's still going to be, as it appears to be moving at this point, it's us against them. It's still, building walls and trying to keep out the other. And we see where this leads. Look at the Brexit. I mean, look at where it leads in the case of the UK itself. But the European Union is really, I think, at great risk of breaking up, if it's not in the process of breaking apart as we speak. And it's really sad. And I'm not speaking politically here. I'm really speaking in broader social, almost philosophical terms about how you view humanity. How you view is there a common humanity? And I think the refugee crisis, as we look at it, is a test of our common humanity. And at the moment, I have to say, Europe is failing the test.
According to EU officials, nearly 1 billion euros have been allocated to Greece and NGOs operating in Greece in order to manage the refugee crisis effectively. However, in many cases, infrastructure remains poor, many detention centers are understaffed. So more specifically at the Greek level, where do you attribute this lack of coordination and effectiveness? And then obviously I'd like your view on the government's response, essentially.
I mean, I'm not privy to the internal workings of either at the EU level or Greece itself. I can tell you what I saw myself. I can tell you that whatever money's out there is not being properly spent. if the money is available. I don't know whose pocket it's going into, or what other problems there may be in implementation, but the conditions just to make it absolutely clear, to not be able to even put a roof over someone's head, to not even put a proper tent over their heads. I was there when a rainstorm broke out, and people were just, the plastic sheeting that they had put up in makeshift ways with sticks, was filling with water and then would fall apart and collapse on top of them. There simply was not, in the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in Greece, there was not the minimal requirements that would be met with actually a minimal amount of money being spent. And that simply wasn't there to be seen. The food was poor condition. Security was almost non-existent. Camp management was non-existent in some of these places. Shelter was completely inadequate. On and on and on. Look at every measure. And so, if there's I'll take you at your word that there was €1 billion that went to Greece. I certainly didn't see how anything close to that was being spent. You have protracted refugee situations like the Somalia situation going on since the early 1990s, the situation in Afghanistan going on since the early 1980s, the late 70s, and Pakistan now, pushing back Afghan refugees. You have Kenya forcing back Somali refugees and threatening to close this large camp. You have on Syria's borders the Turkish government shooting asylum seekers and preventing them from seeking asylum. And you have on the Jordanian border bulldozing an earthen berm, as it's called, and more than 70,000 Syrians stranded on the Syrian side of the berms, where with huge amount of negotiation, the most you can get is a crane that drops some food supplies in, as opposed to allowing people to come in to seek asylum from the threats to their lives that they're experiencing. So we have right now, on the front lines of the major refugee crises of the world, a threat to the fundamental principle of non-refoulement. In all of these places, refugees being pushed back, refugees being rejected at the borders, the frontline states have said, we can't handle this. We have reached our capacity. In some cases, we've been doing this for decades, and we're unwilling, and we cannot do this any longer, and we're closing our borders. And the consequence is that people are going to be killed. People are going to die because they can't get to the very first level of asylum, as bad as that might be. And then what we're seeing in these protracted situations, after 4 years, 5 years, whatever, in places like Greece and Lebanon, a country which has over a quarter of its population are refugees, refugees will move on. They are survivors. And if their children can't go to school, and if they can't work, and if they can't live some basic, decent life, and they have any capacity to get on a rubber boat or whatever it might be and risk their lives, they're going to take that risk finally. And so they will end up in Europe. Europe has been very short-sighted. It hasn't really looked at this crisis or taken account of it until it reached its own doors, or in fact, people came in to European countries. And the response overwhelmingly has been, okay, we'll just build stronger, bigger doors with bigger locks on them and keep people out. That's sort of the Hungarian response, if you will. And then the dominoes, fall one after the other. As you look at the Western Balkans and you look at the doors closing from Austria, Serbia, Macedonia, Hungary, and guess who ends up holding the bag for the European Union? It's going to be Greece.
Do you think politicians are exploiting the situation or driving the situation?
A little of both. I think that certainly someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary is using this to score political points, being a bit of a demagogue when it comes to not just refugees, but foreigners, anyone who's different, Muslims, whatever it might be, the other that are non-Hungarians that are coming with a darker hue to their skin or a different way of praying. And so feeding on prejudices and feeding on fears, and there are security threats that are real, of course, but you take an attack as the attack in November in Paris, and then you blow it out of all proportion, and you apply it to groups that were not in any way involved, in the attack. You stigmatize, large groups of people and ordinary people who are, just looking for being able to live in, a basically decent life of safety and not being trapped in a camp somewhere, on some border where food is being dropped to you by a crane. So I think there's a great deal of exploitation, but I also think that this beggar thy neighbor approach of trying to divert refugee flows to the next person over, I think that approach, very simplistic and short-sighted approach, is one that does exacerbate the situation. And it creates, ill will, obviously, with neighboring countries, and ultimately you're making refugees, who are human beings at the end of the day, into, political footballs, pinballs, whatever metaphor you might want to use for, pushing people around and in some ways even using them perhaps in punitive ways to, if you don't like the way that Greece has handled its economy or whatever, it's sort of saying, okay, here's a little punishment as well. And you're already chaotic, what's a little more chaos for you guys? I'm not a European myself. I'm an observer when it comes to Europe. But that lack of solidarity, even at the European level, not even talking about solidarity with Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, Somalis, and other human beings, but within Europe itself, there's an enormous amount of backbiting and finger pointing and a lack of appreciation for what the countries on the external borders of the European Union, whether it be Greece or Bulgaria or Malta, what they actually go through when they see a large influx of refugees. Again, it shouldn't be exaggerated what that challenge may represent to those states, but it would be ever so much more manageable if the responsibility was shared equitably among the EU member states, and more broadly, globally, among the community of nations. And that's, again, a failure that we're still contending with.